Welcome back. Now, inflation has edged lower in March, hitting a two-month low at 5.3% year-on-year from 5.6% previously. This largely thanks to a cooling in food prices. On a month-to-month basis, however, CPI is up 0.8%. Kevin Lings, who's chief economist at Stanlib, joins us with his analysis of this print and what the trajectory suggests for future prints and interest rate decisions. Kevin, always a pleasure. Good afternoon to you.
Thanks a lot for the invite.
All right, slightly lower than what we all thought. Is this something that should make us feel a little bit more optimistic about inflation?
I think it's slightly better. Obviously, the monthly increase is still substantial. Hey? So 0.8% in a month is a significant increase. But I guess it was, as you say, slightly below expectations. Part of the increase related to the fuel price. So I think that was anticipated. Part of the increase related to the excise duties in the February budget, and we saw that in the alcohol and tobacco's product. So we've got to accept that. The increase in education, I thought, was on the high side. It's over 6% now, so that's very unfortunate. If you go back, I think it's 2 years, education inflation in South Africa was 4.1%. So it's been moving up over the last couple of years, now over 6%. I think that's a very unfortunate outcome. But if I look at, say, rental, there was a survey of rental inflation that was up very modest, just over 3%. So not too much of a problem. If I put all of those numbers together, I would say that it remains manageable. You know, an inflation rate of 4.3% is acceptable, but I think we've got to reflect on the fact that the Reserve Bank wants 4.5%. And they've been very clear that they want to get inflation anchored at 4.5%. Now, that doesn't mean that we've got to wait for 4.5% before we cut interest rates. Well, at least I hope that doesn't mean that, because I think it's going to be a long wait. I think that over the coming months, we're going to find inflation under a little bit of pressure. We've still got a couple of petrol price increases. We've still got a big electricity price increase. And I think inflation is going to be hovering around the 5.5% level for a few more months. Then towards the end of the year, I've actually got it coming down to around about 4.6% thereabouts. And I think that outlook, that sort of shorter term towards the end of the year outlook, should be enough to allow the Reserve Bank to consider cutting interest rates this year. I don't think it's enough to cut immediately. I think that perhaps as we go deeper into the second half of the year, I think the inflation data will look better. And then I think the Reserve Bank can start the interest rate cutting cycle then.
What is, I think, also surprising for me, Kevin, is how stubborn inflation remains in the United States and how that has, of course, a bearing on our own decisions here at home. And, of course, what we do know is that the United States economy, that has a little bit more room and strength to really withstand some of this very restrictive policy. But here at home, we're trying to eke out 1% growth. Can we still, if we keep interest rate cuts till the very last minute, possibly seeing only one cut this year?
Yeah, so I think the US has got its own dynamic around inflation. I don't think it's necessarily reflecting what's going on in the rest of the world. If I look at, say, Europe's inflation rate, that's much, much closer to 2%. And I think Europe is setting themselves up to cut interest rates in June, ahead of the Federal Reserve. So I think the US has some of its own dynamics that is resulting in their inflation rate remaining what they call sticky, a little bit elevated, and will take longer to bring it under control. And clearly that we've got to pay attention to that, right? Partly because there may be some elements going on internationally that can result in some inflationary pressure, and the geopolitics right now has to be a concern. And so central banks will pretty much want to wait and see what happens with the Iran issue and Israel issue before they really go into interest rate cutting mode. So I think we've got to pay attention to that. Obviously, we've also got to pay attention to when the US is considering cut in rates, because that has a bearing on most central banks. But I think our Reserve Bank can move before the Federal Reserve. I don't think it's entirely dependent on the Federal Reserve. They clearly watch it. They're clearly mindful of what international interest rates are doing. But I was looking just last month, 17 central banks cut interest rates in the world last month, and most of those are emerging markets. So we've got an element of interest rate cuts already unfolding. I think for South Africa, it's getting past the short-term pressure that is in the inflation data that we can see materializing, getting closer towards the end of the year, and then hopefully that timing is appropriate. Hopefully by then, Europe has cut. Hopefully by then, the US is considering cutting rates. And I think it would then be appropriate for us to cut rates. So we've got to be mindful of the global environment. But at this stage, I don't think that negates the path we're on to some interest rates moving lower in South Africa.
Kevin, I do suspect that the rest of the world, and I think South Africa too, will have post-inflation stress disorder for a very long time to come here. And I know that our Reserve Bank has spoken also about inflation targeting and bringing 2% into our conversation. I'm keen to get your thoughts on that, and the benefits of that, if there are any, once we're over this, this kind of streak of inflation, then starting to try to anchor our inflation closer to the 2% mark.
Look, I think getting our inflation anchored at 4.5% or lower is ultimately a good objective. There's no doubt that it helps you with competitiveness. It helps you to be able to export more successfully if you can keep your price pressure low. It certainly should help you in terms of your currency performance. We can see that around the world. So I think it is a good objective. The target of 3 to 6% is on the high side if you consider where many other countries are, even emerging markets. If I look at Brazil, their target is 2% to 4% effectively. Our target tends to be on the high side, and I think the Reserve Bank would like to see our number move lower, and something around the 4%, 4.5% would be appropriate, I think, for South Africa. But I think we've got to be realistic about how quickly we can achieve that and how aggressive we want to be with interest rates in order to achieve it. I think we need to go back when we first introduced the inflation target. We were sitting at a range of 6 to 9%. We introduced it at 3 to 6, and it took us time to achieve that target. It's not like you would go to a lower average level instantaneously. And I think if we have that mindset, if we try and work towards, say, a 4.5%, a 4% level, over time, I think that would be good. A 2% level, I think, is too big an ask at this stage. And there's a lot of international debate about whether 2% is actually an appropriate target, even for the United States and Europe. So I wouldn't support a 2% idea. But an idea of South Africa being towards the lower end of the range of 3 to 6, I think that's fair, and it's something we should ultimately have as a goal.
Well, Kevin, a pleasure having you. Thank you so much for speaking to us through this other print. It's been very beneficial. That was Kevin Lings, who's Chief Economist at Stanlib.